Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're coming in from. We'll just give a couple more minutes just for everybody able to trickle into the webinar here. Thank you for joining us here at WinMagic. And so we'll kick off now. Thank you for joining us. Again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're coming in from. And thank you for joining us here for the MagicEndpoint No User Action Authentication webinar. For those of you that I have not met before, my name is Lloyd Grimes. I will be your moderator and host for today. So I am actually part of the customer success team here at WinMagic, and will help you guide through this webinar and speaking with our online expert, Gary, who actually I'll introduce now. Gary McCracken is our security leader here, leader in data communications and information security for more than 30 years. Gary actually represents WinMagic at a number of industry security organizations, including the Trusted Computing Group and FIDO Alliance. He's also playing double duty. He actually is our CISO as well as our VP of Technology. Gary, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
So for our agenda today, we're actually going to have Gary step us through the evolution of authentication, why traditional MFA is no longer doing the job that even today's passwordless solutions have limitations, and when it comes to supporting a zero trust, always verify strategy. In this webinar, we'll actually present a new way of thinking about authentication that has the benefit of providing the best user experience and security while future-proofing your organization and their authentication strategies. Then he'll actually introduce our solution, MagicEndpoint, next generation authentication solution that goes beyond passwordless authentication, where no user action is actually required because the endpoint itself does the remote authentication on behalf of the user. Gary, thank you for joining us, and I'll leave the floor to you.
Thank you for the introduction, Lloyd. And let's jump right in with Trends Impact Radar. You've probably seen these things before, but let's sort of explain how it works. The center here in yellow is immediate impact in terms of time from 0 to 1 year. And as you go out to the edge, it gets longer in terms of impact, say up to 6 to 8 years. And in the size of the bullets or the circles here, the bigger the size, the more the impact. And the reason why we're showing you this today is because Gartner has listed passwordless authentication as the highest impact technology in the next year or two, because it helps with companies with two major problems. It reduces data breaches right away and improves user experience. And the kind of passwordless authentication we're talking about is the cryptographic-based passwordless authentication, not things like one-time password or push. We'll get into that a little bit later. So let me sort of step us through the history or the evolution of authentication over the last, well, I guess a few decades, because passwords have been around quite a while. We're going to plot them on this chart here with user experience on the x-axis, from poor to good, and security on the y-axis, from low to high. And so in the beginning, we'll start with passwords. They're low on security and poor on user experience for probably a lot of the reasons that you're aware of. But we'll point out one here is that a password is a shared secret. It's something the user knows and the remote service or the server knows, and that makes it vulnerable to attack on both sides, and all the other complexity reasons and user complexity reasons, usability reasons that you're aware of. So the next step in the evolution was to add two passwords, a second factor. And those passwords were added something like SMS text message, a one-time password. That could have been to on a token or to a phone or a push, or even in some cases, no password, but just a push to a phone, to a mobile phone authenticator. That makes it definitely more secure. That's why it's higher up here in security, but potentially pushes it further to the left in the user experience, to the poor side. Because now you might have passwords plus this extra thing, this extra phone to fumble with. But it was definitely an improvement. Unfortunately, these two factors are still phishable. users can still be tricked into giving up their credentials to attackers. And so in response to the many breaches in the last few years, US government and others have pressed forward with a zero trust strategy, which does not allow a one-time password push and SMS anymore. And gave a little bit of a reference here and actually a quote from one of the zero trust documents from the US government. The US government so have raised the bar in security, pushing these traditional factors, and I'll just raise the bar here right now, into the poor user experience, low security quadrant. So this zero trust is a dramatic paradigm shift. And it's basically a move away from perimeter security to continual verification of each user and each device. So you're no longer just behind a VPN and everything's all good. There's no specific advantage of being on the network. You have to verify the user and the device. So this leaves public key passwordless authentication as the only solution in the good quadrant. And a couple examples that these documents give of technologies that are passwordless that fit this bill are FIDO2 WebAuthn and PIV cards. They're both examples of phishing-resistant passwordless authentication. However, the main tenet of zero trust is never trust, always verify. So if you're using, one of these authentication methods, then you're could be very often bothering the user to authenticate and re-authenticate on an ongoing basis if you're really going to be always verifying. So that's not really a good user experience. If the user has to do the authentication continuously with zero trust, that moves the bar to the right in terms of user experience. So now, with password authentication here, still very secure, but on the poor side of the user experience, that leaves the good quadrant empty. So what is an organization to do if they need zero trust, always verify, but phishing resistance, and they can't afford to burden their users with that continual verification, because we know if we do, they'll find a way around it. Well, that's why we're here today. That's where WinMagic's MagicEndpoint no user action comes in. It's very strong from a security perspective, like passwordless, because it's public key based and phishing resistant. Yet it provides a very good experience because the endpoint itself can continuously verify the user and doesn't bother the user to do that. Oh, time for poll number one. Lloyd?
Certainly. Thank you, Gary. So what we wanted to find out from our audience, and again, just to recap a little bit here, we want to make this as interactive as possible. So we do have some Q&As open there. But as you can see up on the screen, we want to find out what stage you guys are with regards to the evolution of authentication. And so we'll wait here for actually the poll to go through and everybody to answer the question so we can get a feel for the audience and what you guys are facing. Okay, so pulling that back in, we've actually got the results back. So it looks like about 64% of the audience rely on passwords plus a traditional MFA. Interesting numbers, wouldn't you say there, Gary? And so we saw 27% at just relying just on passwords as well.
Yes, and those and those organizations are probably most interested in what to do next. And I think they have an opportunity to skip a generation in the evolution and skip by SMS text messages and some of these things that others maybe adopted 5 or 10 years ago because, well, they were the best of breed 5 or 10 years ago. So that's one thing I note from these. And then the ones that, and we have a good hunk here in on traditional MFA, as those start to consider a zero trust strategy, you may find some of what we're about to explain interesting. On to the next slide, Lloyd. Oh, I guess you're on mute. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so let me give an example of a traditional MFA and then I'll contrast that to how it would be with MagicEndpoint. So in this case, we have a user who's going to access Office 365. So he connects in Office 365 in the traditional way. Maybe types in his Active Directory password, but we have MFA. So pulls out his phone, maybe a company issued phone, authenticates to the phone, authenticates to the authenticator on the phone, because hopefully we're not using SMS text messages, because that's not very good. Gets a one-time password, usually not quite this simple. It enters the one-time password into the screen, and he's authenticated. It's definitely more secure than passwords alone, but it's also phishable. It's almost as phishable as just passwords alone, because if there's somebody in the middle who could capture the password in this exercise, they could have captured the one-time password in the returning token. So, and the user experience involves two devices and going back and forth between the two devices. Now let's take a look at what it would be like with MagicEndpoint. The user wants to connect to, say, Office 365, so they connect and they're authenticated. And then the endpoint itself performs all the remote authentication. Now, I think you're probably at this point saying, how could that even be possible? Well, let me try to explain that right now. What it requires is a new way of thinking. Well, zero trust in itself, even the government and others call it a paradigm shift. Well, you need a new way of thinking on how you do your authentication in order to meet that new strategy. The endpoint performing all the remote authentications on behalf of the user is certainly a new paradigm. So let me, and we're going to show you something here that has something benefits in terms of user experience, security, and total cost of ownership, these new ways of thinking. And this, I'm going to step you through the picture here to help explain it. So we have a user that has some biometrics maybe built into the computer, or they type in a PIN or a password, whatever. They have a computer, a laptop with a TPM, Trusted Platform chip. And they have a bunch of different service providers that they'd like to connect, whether it's VPN or Office 365 or so forth. And this purple line here, that is where the remote access happens. Now, the old way of thinking is that remote access requires MFA. So that would be, for example, this user has to type in the one-time password that goes all the way through to the remote server, maybe obtained from a phone. Again, that's a shared secret. Now, the first new way of thinking is that for remote access, no MFA is required, just for this remote part. Public key-based password authentication, as prescribed by NIST and others, is orders of magnitude more secure because it is cryptographically based and there are no shared secrets, like there is a password, a one-time password. The crypto is performed by the device here with the help of the TPM, not the end user. Well, it's not something an end user could do. It's not the kind of crypto that a person could do. They're capable of entering a password, but not doing this advanced crypto. So that's I would say, the first new way of thinking. Whoops, I'm going to go forward. So the next way of thinking, new way of thinking, I want to stress is that the client in this authentication is not the actual user, but the endpoint representing the user. And there can be several different users sharing the device, but each user/device, user and device together combination, has its own unique key. The endpoint knows which user is in control of the device at any one time, so only that user's key is available for remote authentications. Like, so for instance, if one user logs into Windows and then they do some things and they log out and another user logs in, the endpoint can keep those completely separate with completely separate keys. So that's another new way of thinking. And the third way of thinking, the new way of thinking, and the idea is to separate the user authenticating to the endpoint here from the endpoint authenticating to the remote application. Go forward here a bit. With this separation, the user does their authentication to the endpoint, not the remote server. And so this is where MFA comes in. For the endpoint to strongly authenticate the user and verify their intent, maybe even continuously possible. So they could be typing, they could be a local PIN, not a password in this case. or biometrics, or any other kind of MFA. But the idea is that they're actually authenticating to the endpoint at this point, not remote application. To recap the three new ways of thinking, you don't need MFA for remote authentication, and the user is not needed for that remote authentication, and that the endpoint is separate from the remote access. So let's take a look at those distinct benefits that this new way of thinking brings. Well, one benefit is that for the remote access, you get the best possible user experience that can be achieved. That's because it's no user action. And this is because the endpoint itself is capable of doing that on the user's behalf. Or in certain circumstances, the endpoint is capable of being configured or deciding whether or not it should require an explicit MFA for extra sensitive applications, like maybe it's a payroll or something. We might have 1 out of 10 or 1 out of 50 remote applications that need to have that elevated amount of authentication. And the other benefit is that it's highly secure, because the endpoint can do the ongoing public key-based cryptography required to do the password authentication to the server. And it's secure because the attacker would need to steal the laptop with the TPM in it in order to access the remote servers. So if the attacker is in another city or another country or another continent, they won't be able to access your remote servers and attack them, because they don't have that TPM in that endpoint device. And by separating and distinguishing the endpoint access and the remote access, as mentioned before, it supports a zero trust, always verify strategy without bombarding the user with MFA requests every time they want to go to a separate remote application. The endpoint can take care of it. And finally, these new ways of thinking enable the lowest total cost of ownership. You don't need this extra MFA hardware. You might have corner cases or something where you might want to bring them into play, and MagicEndpoint supports that. But for the mainline use case of a user on a laptop, they're not needed, and that means less devices, less complexity, no passwords, so less help desk calls, and the user has just basically less to do. And one console, if you're using our encryption, to manage both encryption and the endpoint. I'll have a little bit more on that later. But let's just take a look at MagicEndpoint authentication in terms of conditional access and security level. And by security level, we really mean authentication assurance level. How sure you are that you really authenticated the right person. And here we, in column 1, we have from low, which is medium, to high, to very high. And then in column 2, we have different types of users' actions. It could be entering a password, it could be 2FA, biometrics, or no user action. And as we mentioned before, the US government and others have raised the bar in security, and it comes in about here. Invalidating and no longer allowing those low and medium levels, because they use things like password alone or passwords with phones or with push or one-time passwords. So they're really sort of ruled out. That's where the bar starts. Now, where does MagicEndpoint come in? MagicEndpoint comes in here from about level 4 on up. And it basically has the set of options, depending on which ones you choose at any particular one for any particular application, to cover all these levels. I want to say the sweet spot is sort of the high level of security and the no user action, because it's highly secure and great from user experience. But there may be cases, as I mentioned before, where an extra MFA is required for that remote access, and maybe even you want to bring in a locally connected Bluetooth supported phone as an extra authentication device. Again, MagicEndpoint supports those use cases too. But the point here is, with these simple, correct solutions, MagicEndpoint covers the high end of the spectrum of security level. Oh, we got another poll, Lloyd.
Thank you for that outline, Gary. So with this new poll, we want to find out, how are you rating the user experience within your organization? We've got a few choices there and being able to go from there. And we'll let the poll go for a minute and then have that pop up. Again, there's a Q&A box. Feel free to drop a question if you have one in there, and we can go from there. If we can get the results for the poll pulled up. So what we're seeing, Gary, and what I'm seeing here is we're falling between good and fair. Not a lot of people feeling it's excellent, but I mean, as a password user myself and looking at that authentication and what's happening out there, I think this probably seems about right across the board, no?
Well, yeah, I think when we looked at the other answers, was that I think most were either password only or password with an extra MFA factor.
Right.
So those two, clock in at the fair, the good. I wonder who the excellent is and what kind of technology that they're using or what kind of security policies they have. But I think these are not surprising. Okay. Let's just go
to the next
to our
slide.
next slide. All right. So this shows where Magic Endpoint shows up to the, compares to the alternatives. And I always like to start with security, and I'll point out that certainly it's phishing resistant, and not other. And the X means not supported, and of course the check mark means it is supported. And you can see that at least two of the other alternatives aren't really even phishing alternative, phishing resistant. That's important to any zero trust authentication strategy. And then that's where, and phone solutions, that's where most phone solutions fall short, and one-time password falls short too. But where I think the real strength of Magic Endpoint is future-proofing against emerging threats. You probably heard of, and one of the emerging threats is attack on push attacks on phones and other attacks on using phones. And the root of the vulnerability of this vulnerability that makes them possible, and for phishing and other attacks, is really their out-of-band nature. So you have a complete separate device from the laptop that you're using that you're authenticating to get the service. And so the trouble is associating that out-of-band authentication with the legitimate user on the laptop that needs to access the server. So it might seem like a good idea, but the vulnerability is when the user pushes approve on the phone, is that associated directly with the user who just tried to access that service, or is there a man in the middle, or is it somebody just happened to beat it by timing? Anyway, that out-of-band nature is a fundamental problem with authentication with out-of-band devices like phones, but it's where Magic Endpoint architecturally has a great advantage, because it runs on the endpoint, and the Magic Endpoint can monitor the user and monitor the user's intent. So they know that user on that device with that TPM was the one that just tried to get that remote service. And there's no guesswork with trying to associate that with some kind of out-of-band authentication. Okay, then there's user experience. The hallmark of Magic Endpoint, of course, is up here at the top, and the no user action required, which is where we sort of outshine everyone else. But also, if you integrate with our full disk encryption, we can have single sign-on from pre-boot into Windows, into the remote applications, and signing on and authenticating the endpoint user, the endpoint authenticated at pre-boot is probably one of the best places to do it, because you haven't yet loaded the operating system in its huge amount of code and a huge amount of attack surface. You've got a very small piece of code there doing just one job, authenticating that user. And then there's enterprise management, and use cases covered from recovery, deployment, shared devices, and of course the only product with one console for both encryption and remote authentication, which is a good lead up to my final slide. WinMagic has been in the business and been a leader in full disencryption. That's on the endpoint, requires a lot of endpoint authentication knowledge and a lot of endpoint competency for over 20 years. We were the first one actually to have the AES algorithm certified by NIST. That's a FIPS certification. Feature rich, we have features like capabilities like pre-boot connectivity, where they actually have pre-boot before the operating system loads, and comprehensive Windows, Mac, Linux, server, removable device, file encryption, very comprehensive. And I would say the only enterprise grade Linux management system. To that, we've now added under the same console our MagicEndpoint with our FIDO2 capability for unfederated access, and our architecture and IDP for federated access. That no user action hallmark feature of MagicEndpoint, and comprehensively covering that along with encryption. So we have raised the bar now for authentication, and we've combined that with best-in-class full disencryption manageable under one console. And we better get into the Q&A. It looks like we're running a little late, Lloyd.
Thank you for that outline, Gary. Appreciate it. So jumping into the Q&A, the first question that has popped up and was sent across to us was, so the user just does nothing, or does the user have anything to do at all?
Okay, well, the user has to authenticate to the endpoint in the first place. You just can't walk up to the laptop and everything's magic. So they authenticate securely, probably with MFA to the endpoint. But yes, after that, they don't need to do anything, because once the user has signed into the endpoint does the actual authentication to all the remote services. So there is no user action to authenticate to the remote services.
Okay. And so you say that this is more than secure, better security than what we have in place currently. How is that? That's another question from the group.
Well, if we're talking about, in most of our audience here are either using passwords or passwords with, one-time password or mobile push, it's certainly more secure because it's public key based, cryptographically based, with a proof of possession that they have to have through this cryptographic protocol, and it's got phishing resistance built in. So those are all things that most of the people answered the survey do not have yet. And then furthermore, MagicEndpoint has this supports the zero trust always verify strategy without overwhelming the user. So it's not like you can just say, well, let's do MFA, once in a month, or have them and then not bother with them. What we can do is we can be more secure because we can be always checking and authenticating the user transparently under the covers without having a user experience impact.
Got it. Okay. And then I guess we have time for maybe two more questions. The first one coming in is, how can it be more secure? What do you do internally?
Well, I think I alluded to a bit, but we use the Trusted Platform module, the TPM, that's on all business class laptops, probably all laptops. Right. It's got hardware-based anti-hammering. It makes it impossible for attackers to sort of get at the keys. And it also makes it impossible for them to fake or replicate that user. Even if they do a whole device or a whole image of all the software on that device and move it to another device somewhere else, they haven't duplicated the TPM because that's a hardware chip built into the motherboard. And so that it's really not really, you can't really replicate it and attack it somewhere else.
Got it. And then so there's one that I think kind of piggybacks off of that, where it says, what about devices without a TPM chip? Where do they store the certificate?
Well, as I say, I think almost all devices have TPM, but we do have other modes. We have a software mode, and we have a mode where you can use a Bluetooth connected phone. And in this case, we use the security hardware in the phone itself to protect the key.
Sounds good. Okay. And now I know that we're not going to get to everyone's questions, so we'll do a follow-up. And as you may know, we were recording this session We'll also do direct follow-up with those questions that we weren't able to answer and be able to get back to you in a timely fashion. So if you have any other questions with our team or you want to find out a little bit more, please use the email address that you see here up on the screen. We want to thank you for taking the time to be able to meet with us and understand what's taking place with regards to passwordless authentication and seeing our MagicEndpoint solution. So I think at this time, it's thank you and have a great afternoon, great evening, good day. And keep in mind that we actually have, yes, a demo coming up with regards to seamless logon streamlines. And that's taking place April 21st. And that'll be the next webinar that we'll be hosting here on our webinar series. Thank you for the time. Gary, as always, a pleasure hearing from you and being able to get that insight from you. Thank you for the time.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure. Bye.
Bye now.